Thank you for joining me to learn more about getting involved in wildlife rehabilitation. I'm Maggie McCartney, the coordinator for the Wildlife Center of Virginia's Wildlife Care Academy. One of the most frequent questions we receive on our general contact email is, how do I get started, or how do I get involved in wildlife rehabilitation? This is a great question to hear because, of course, we always need more wildlife rehabilitators and caregivers to help care for the many patients harmed or displaced by human activities. However, starting out as a new wildlife rehabilitator is no small or simple task. One must start by understanding the regulations, guidelines, and ethics, as well as practical resources and costs involved in wildlife rehabilitation. Our hope is that this orientation will present you with the processes and resources needed to help you find your path into this field and to build a network of support around you. First, we must truly understand what wildlife rehabilitation is about. Wildlife rehabilitation is the process of rescuing, raising, and arranging for veterinary medical care of orphaned, sick, displaced, and injured wild animals, with a goal of releasing them back into their natural habitats. For rehabilitation to be deemed successful, these released animals must be able to truly function as wild animals. This includes being able to recognize and obtain the appropriate foods, select mates of their own species and reproduce, and show the appropriate fear of potential dangers, including humans. Our collective goal is to release viable, healthy animals back into their habitats, where they can fulfill their potential in the natural world. To take from the wild only those creatures needing assistance, and to return to the wild only those creatures deemed ready to face the challenge of survival. To make captive a healthy, functioning wild animal, or to release a patient that would struggle to survive and reproduce, would be ethically challenged by the very definition of wildlife rehabilitation. Someone interested in entering the field of wildlife rehabilitation should make certain considerations before beginning and while developing their career. These considerations will serve as the outline of this introduction. First, one must recognize the importance of trained, informed, and permitted wildlife rehabilitation. There are many reasons that the public should not care for wildlife, some of which are related to laws and regulations. Each new rehabilitator must also carefully consider his or her own interests and resources. It's a good idea to start with one species or type of animal first, get comfortable and confident with that before moving on to other species or animal groups. After deciding what we want to do, it's time to identify the permitting agency. Familiarize yourself with the permit conditions, locate mentors, supporters, and training opportunities, and map out your path to reach your rehabilitation goals. Finally, I want to emphasize the importance of providing intentional and optimal care to our wild patients, but offering that same care, respect, and gentleness to ourselves and to our peers as well. The field of wildlife rehabilitation depends upon the community that exists within it. Our professional and personal connections with each other allow us to feel supported, enriched, and successful, even in the days that we never leave the songbird room from sunrise to sunset. Wildlife rehabilitation should never be attempted by a member of the general public or by an untrained individual for a wide range of reasons. Wildlife rehabilitators are dedicated to understanding and applying the natural history of the patients in their care. Providing experiences that mimic a wild life as closely as possible is essential for the successful rehabilitation of these patients. So understanding what the wild lives of our patients look like is really key. Wildlife rehabilitators know what skills their young patients need to be learning at each stage of development and can provide care appropriately to avoid human habituation and to ensure that each squirrel is learning to be a squirrel and each finch a finch. Because they generally have more than one patient of a given species, wildlife rehabilitators also have the advantage of providing conspecifics, or other members of the same species, to help in the rearing process. This may occur in the form of surrogate parents, surrogate litter mates, or other creative means of helping connect patients with one another. Finally, wildlife rehabilitators have skills, training, and experience, as well as access to other professionals when cases require more specialized care, such as consulting with veterinarians. Untrained individuals simply lack the background knowledge and the resources needed to provide care for wildlife. When wild animals in need of human care are taken to a trained and permitted wildlife rehabilitator within the first 24 hours after being found, the release rate for those patients is doubled. Wildlife raised by a trained and permitted rehabilitator learns to function properly as a wild member of its species, increasing its function and survival post-release. Members of the public that provide improper care for wildlife often mean well but can cause serious harm. One example is rescuers providing kitten formula, which of course is developed for carnivores, to baby cottontails, which are obligate herbivores. To an untrained eye, the two young mammals are similar, but a basic understanding of their natural history, anatomy, and rehabilitation challenges immediately reveals what a poor and dangerous choice this is. Another reason wildlife should be cared for only by permitted wildlife rehabilitators is that it's simply the law. In general, state permits are required to care for mammals and reptiles if it's allowed at all. Birds protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act generally require both state and federal permits. Additionally, listed species or those that are threatened or endangered either federally or at the state level often require additional permits to care for. It's the legal responsibility of a permitted wildlife rehabilitator to understand and abide by these restrictions, meet standards of care, complete continuing education requirements as outlined by their permitting agency, and submit detailed reports of patients and care provided. It is generally illegal for someone who does not hold a wildlife rehabilitation permit to provide care for injured or orphaned wildlife. In most states, the law indicates that rescued wildlife must be transported to a permitted wildlife rehabilitator within 24 hours of rescue. These laws are not intended to prevent the public from intervening when a wild animal is in need of care. In fact, Good Samaritan laws offer legal protection to those acting in effort to rescue an injured or orphaned animal. However, this protection is limited to rescue only. All care must be provided by a permitted rehabilitator. This ensures that animals in need of care are delivered to these permitted carers promptly so that their chances of survival and their success rates in the wild are maximized. My cottontail kitten milk example may sound benign, but the health implications of improper care can be quite serious. Nutritional deficiencies, improper housing, or lack of behavioral conditioning can all lead to painful, irreversible conditions resulting in potentially death for our patients. These songbird patients show a variety of health problems resulting from untrained care, including splay leg, poor bone and feather quality, abscesses, and parasites. You can even see the inappropriate food provided inside the transport container. I don't think I need to explain any further why this is so unfair to these animals. So with all of these factors considered, what does it take to become a wildlife rehabilitator? What do you need to bring to the table? The number one element is time. Caring for young wild animals is an incredibly time-consuming process. Nestling songbirds need to be fed sometimes as often as every 15 minutes throughout the entire day. If you can't or aren't willing to dedicate every single day to caring for your wild patients, wildlife rehabilitation is not for you. Now, keep in mind that not every species has the same care needs, so different animal groups will require a different amount of time each day. For example, in contrast to my songbird example, eastern cottontails are crepuscular and are naturally fed only twice daily, once around dawn and again around dusk. Therefore, young cottontails in rehabilitation are best left alone in a quiet, warm space for the entire day, allowing cottontail rehabilitators a little more freedom in their schedules. Seasonality is another time factor. Rehabilitators caring for orphaned young animals often have a much lesser caseload in the colder months, but frequently feel overwhelmed during baby season. And finally, keep in mind that wildlife rehabilitation is a long-term commitment. In most places, it takes years to become independently permitted and even longer to advance to uncommon, large, or dangerous species. Understand that if you're looking to work with wildlife for a summer or a year or two, you should consider volunteering at an established facility instead of seeking your own permit. Another element that a new rehabilitator will need to provide is space. When you're providing care as an apprentice or a carer at an existing facility, this may not be an issue, but if your intention is to rehabilitate wildlife at your own home or facility, you will need to consider the space required for the species in your care. Rehabilitators must house patients separately from their living space. This may be a separate room or an outbuilding, all the way up to a full rehabilitation facility with multiple buildings and large outdoor acclimation enclosures, depending on the species treated and the caseload. Raptors require flight pens for pre-release conditioning, while songbirds and small mammals can be prepared for release in much smaller outdoor enclosures. The space you have available is important to consider. The element of space is another example of how networking with other rehabilitators can provide important support. For example, a raptor center with specialized flight pens may receive transfers of birds of prey from other facilities, and may transfer out healthy orphan small mammals to specialized home rehabilitators with smaller facility spaces. Even though no one likes to think about this one, we of course have to consider the financial cost of caring for wildlife. Purchasing food, building enclosures, funding medical care, and all the other odds and ends that go into rehabilitation really add up. There are ways to fundraise and gain community support, but most rehabilitators are almost entirely self-funded. And to be a wildlife rehabilitator takes ethics. The ethics of wildlife rehabilitation are clear, and it's essential that those in this field are guided by ethical decision making and respect for the wildness of our patients. Fortunately, we aren't in the dark with regards to what ethics to follow. The National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association has published the Wildlife Rehabilitators Code of Ethics. This document provides the framework for every element of wildlife rehabilitation and should be studied carefully. A wildlife rehabilitator should strive to achieve high standards of animal care through knowledge and an understanding of the field. Individuals must make an effort to be informed of current rehabilitation information, methods, and regulations through participation in continuing education. A wildlife rehabilitator should be responsible, conscientious, and dedicated, and should work continuously towards improving the quality of care given to wild animals undergoing rehabilitation. A wildlife rehabilitator must abide by local, state, provincial, and federal laws concerning wildlife rehabilitation, and associated activities. A wildlife rehabilitator should establish safe work habits and conditions, abiding by current health and safety practices at all times. A wildlife rehabilitator should acknowledge limitations and enlist the assistance of a veterinarian and other trained professionals when appropriate. A wildlife rehabilitator should respect other rehabilitators and persons in related fields, sharing skills and knowledge in the spirit of cooperation for the welfare of animals. A wildlife rehabilitator should place optimum animal care above personal gain. A wildlife rehabilitator should strive to provide professional and humane care in all phases of wildlife rehabilitation, protecting the welfare, respecting the wildness, and maintaining the dignity of each animal in life and in death. Releasable animals should be maintained in a wild condition and released as soon as appropriate. Non-releasable animals have a right to euthanasia. A wildlife rehabilitator should encourage community support and involvement through volunteer training and public education. The common goal should be to promote a responsible concern for living beings and the welfare of the environment. A wildlife rehabilitator should work from a foundation of sound ecological principles, incorporating appropriate conservation ethics and an attitude of stewardship. A wildlife rehabilitator should conduct all business activities and communications in a professional manner with honesty, integrity, compassion, and commitment, realizing that an individual's conduct reflects on the entire field of wildlife rehabilitation. After all of these considerations have been made, it's time to determine your personal and professional wildlife rehabilitation goals. What is it that you want to do? Are you looking to care for injured and orphaned wildlife in your own home or facility? Are you more interested in establishing yourself as a staff member or volunteer at an established rehabilitation facility? Maybe you aren't ready for a full-blown rehabilitation role and you're interested in acting as a volunteer transporter, a helpline volunteer, or other non-rehabilitation role. And of course, there are a myriad of other circumstances that may require other approaches and different paths. With your goals in mind, the next step is to identify the agency that issues permits for wildlife rehabilitation where you live. In most U.S. states, it will be the state wildlife agencies such as DWR, DNR, Game and Fish, etc. These agencies will have documentation on their websites regarding wildlife rehabilitation, what is allowed in that location, and how to proceed with applying for a permit. Of course, remember that most birds are federally regulated, so if you're looking to start with birds, you will also need to explore the federal regulations and permit conditions. Fortunately, you're not on your own in this venture. As I mentioned before, the field of wildlife rehabilitation is successful only through the community of support, mentorship, education, and professionalism. The National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association and the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council are two well-established professional organizations which provide training, support, and guidelines for wildlife rehabilitators. Most states also have wildlife rehabilitation organizations with which you can become involved. These associations are not only a great source of training and education materials, they're also an important tool for building your network of support. Reach out to other rehabilitators near you or those who work with the species that you're interested in and make connections with them. Most rehabilitators are happy to share ideas, and some may even be willing to take you on as an apprentice if that's what you're looking to do. You can also find a list of permitted wildlife rehabilitators sorted by county on most of those state wildlife agency websites, which can be a great way to start looking for a place to begin. With the need for remote online training opportunities stronger than ever, there are organizations like the Wildlife Care Academy and the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council that offer professional online courses to help fulfill continuing education requirements for wildlife rehabilitators. However, online training is not a substitute for hands-on mentorship with trained and experienced rehabilitators. Most states require an apprenticeship with an existing permit holder prior to being eligible to apply for your own permit. In Virginia, this is a 2-year process at minimum. This intensive hands-on training is absolutely essential for new rehabilitators. Just to provide an example of how rehabilitation permits may be divided, these are the categories of wildlife rehabilitation permits offered in Virginia. Category 1 permit holders are serving as apprentices under Category 2 or 3 permit holders. These Category 1 permittees are training with the intention of later applying for a Category 2 permit in most cases. Category 2 permit holders are individuals or organizations that have completed their apprenticeship and education requirements and met all other permit conditions to be granted an individual rehabilitation permit. Many Category 2 permit holders in Virginia care for wildlife on their own property where they also reside, but some may have separate facilities with staff and volunteers. Category 3 permit holders are wildlife hospitals or teaching hospitals, such as the Wildlife Center of Virginia. These permit holders are able to provide veterinary medical care to wild patients and often also serve as the referring veterinarians for Category 2 permit holders. Categories 4 and 5 are those who care for wildlife under the supervision of Category 2 and 3 permit holders. Category 4 care providers may be a volunteer animal caregiver at a Category 2 organization or a Category 3 organization. Category 5 is distinct from Category 4 because Category 5 students and trainees are in Virginia for rehabilitation training temporarily and plan to leave the wildlife rehabilitation field entirely, as in the case of many of our vet students, or they plan to go to another state to start their rehabilitation career, as in the case of many of our rehab students. Whatever permitting path your governing agency requires, you will need to set up housing and care protocol for wild patients. NWRA and IWRC provide essential materials to aid in this process, including the minimum standards for wildlife rehabilitation, which should serve as a primary resource at any wildlife care facility. Wildlife rehabilitation is limited to native species, which must be kept separate from domestics in a sanitary and safe designated space. These patients must be provided care that maintains their wild condition and natural fear of humans and minimizes habituation. Rehabilitative care must meet or exceed the minimum standards outlined in permit conditions and resources such as the minimum standards publication. Guided by these standards, you will set up your rehabilitation facility. Depending on the species and caseload you anticipate, your rehabilitation facility may range anywhere from a single room in your home, to a barn, to a full-blown private facility with multiple buildings and outdoor enclosures. Start small and give yourself room to grow. Don't try to take on everything in your first season as an independent rehabilitator. These photos show the indoor infant care room as well as the outdoor small mammal complex at the Wildlife Center of Virginia. In the indoor photo, you can see that there is a lot of stuff involved in wildlife care. Having access to storage space, running water, and electricity in your rehabilitation room is essential. In our outdoor enclosures, you'll notice that all of the enclosure doors open into a second enclosed hallway space. This prevents patients from escaping should they slip past a caretaker and out the door of their enclosure. Here are some other great examples of small animal enclosures, both indoors and outdoors, at the Southwest Virginia Wildlife Center, another Category 3 permit holder in Virginia. We see a soft-sided reptarium that allows fledgling birds or hummingbirds to flutter without injuring themselves. There are lamps providing supplemental heat and UV to certain species and ages of wildlife patients. Also, we see the important stress-reducing technique of covering cages to reduce visual stimuli. Anytime you have an opportunity to see existing facilities or photos of their setups, take advantage of that and pay close attention. As I mentioned before, the wildlife rehabilitation community is generally enthusiastic to share ideas, resources, and experience with each other for mutual growth. I have very briefly mentioned how overwhelming and emotionally taxing wildlife rehabilitation can be, and I hope I've properly emphasized the importance of having a network of support, but I want to take a few minutes to talk about this topic in more detail. Personal health, especially mental health, is often the first thing we stop caring about when we're overwhelmed and something has to fall off of our plates. Those of you who already care for wildlife, consider how many times you yourself have missed meals during baby season versus how many times you've allowed your patients to miss a meal. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to skip feeding your patients, of course, but I am saying that active, thoughtful self-care is an essential and non-negotiable element of wildlife rehabilitation. Building a network, setting and maintaining healthy boundaries, and practicing active self-care will help keep you functioning at your best as a healthy, fulfilled, effective wildlife rehabilitator and will help prevent burnout. Your network of support will be unique to you, but it should be as broad and complete as possible, and you should outline it with intention. Maybe you connect with other local rehabilitators, as well as a few caring for the same species as you in other parts of the country. These people will understand your frustrations, your stresses, and your triumphs, unlike any of your personal friends or family might, especially at the beginning. These rehabilitation contacts can also provide practical support in the form of training, consultation, exchange of supplies, transferring of patients. Build strong mutual relationships within this community that you can lean upon and allow others to lean upon you as well. Allow your family and friends into your rehabilitation world. They may not get it, especially at first, but they get you. Let them be emotional support for you when you need it and share your successes with them so that they can have a deeper understanding of your passion for wildlife rehabilitation. Set and maintain clear boundaries for yourself. I cannot stress this enough. Wildlife rehabilitation becomes overwhelming and highly stressful quickly and easily. Specialize in a few specific species, referring calls outside those species to other local rehabilitators. Know your capacity and stick to a firm cap. The network you have built can help you if you're overwhelmed by patients and calls. Consider a designated phone line or set hours for taking calls to prevent yourself from being woken up all throughout the night or never have the ability to step away from your rehabilitation world. When you're not caring for your patients, separate yourself from rehabilitation and focus on other things. Identify the activities that are restorative to you and allow yourself to indulge in them. It's not all about bubble baths and wine glasses, but focusing on caring for yourself can have a pretty profound effect. Feed yourself and stay hydrated. I know it sounds silly, but remember my point about missing meals? Provide yourself at least the same level of care that you offer your patients. Know when you need support and lean on your network for it. If you need someone to bring you lunch, ask someone to bring you lunch. That's why we have friends and family. Never forget to celebrate your successes, focusing on the positive impact that you're having every day in the world of conservation. If this all sounds great and you're ready to get going, here's your to-do list. Identify the permitting agency where you live and carefully read and understand the permit application, guidelines, and training requirements as listed on their webpage. Find and contact local rehabilitators and rehabilitation membership associations to build your network and find mentorship opportunities. Locate and absorb as much training as possible through conferences, online courses, internships, apprentices, and volunteer opportunities. Complete the appropriate permit application for your permitting agency and get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to view this orientation. I hope you feel more prepared to plan your path into wildlife rehabilitation and can step forward with confidence like this box turtle on her way back into the wild.